I'm going to talk about selected artworks from the collections of the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna that reflect or document or show the influence of the Middle East in various surprising ways. Maybe let me start with a few words about the collection where these objects come from, the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. It's one of the 6th largest museums in the world. Most of the collections, most of the artworks were assembled by the Habsburgs over 500 years. It's now housed in a beautiful building on the Ringstrasse, that's the big central boulevard in Vienna. That was built in the late 19th century, and it's one of the most sumptuous museum buildings in the world, and I think it's definitely worth a visit. As I said, most of the objects I'm going to talk about today were assembled by the Habsburgs, so let me start with a few words about them. They're the former ruling family of Austria. They ruled Austria from 1279 until the end of the First World War in 1918, so that's almost 650 years. Here's a map of the domains of the Habsburgs in the early 16th century. This is the time of Emperor Charles V, and you see it covers a large chunk of Central Europe. Unlike many other of the great dynasties of Europe, the Habsburgs didn't have to conquer many of these countries. They inherited them. They married and inherited them. They concluded very advantageous marriage and inheritance contracts. Among the countries they inherited, for example, were Hungary, Bohemia, that's today's Czech Republic, and Slovakia, but also Spain, for example, which in the 16th and 17th century also included the Spanish World Empire, which had colonies in South America and in the Far East. Initially, the Habsburgs were not Austrian emperors. The Austrian Empire was only founded in 1804. They were emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. That's more or less Central Europe. You have a map of the Holy Roman Empire here now. And you see it covers most of Central Europe, parts of northern Italy, and so on. This empire, the German Empire, was not a hereditary empire, which means the son of the emperor did not succeed his father automatically, but every emperor had to be elected by the foremost princes of the empire, the 7 electors. But from 1452 onwards, there was always a Habsburg on the throne of the German Empire, with one very short exception. So the Habsburgs really were one of the most important, most powerful, most influential dynasties in all of Europe. Most of the objects I'm going to talk about date from the 16th and 17th century, mainly because that is a time when there were very intense contacts between Europe, the West, Austria, and the Middle East, good and bad. But the first thing I want to show you is older. It dates from the first half of the 12th century, and it is the coronation mantle of the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, the emperor had to be elected by the electors, and after he was elected, he was crowned with the imperial crown, which dates from the 10th century. And he had to wear very special vestments, very special clothes. He only wore them once in his life. They were usually stored in a church in Nuremberg and brought to wherever the coronation was taking place. Now they're all in Vienna, in the museum in Vienna. And the most amazing of these vestments is the imperial coronation mantle. It's life-size, of course. It falls to the floor. It would be open at the front. The emperor would wear it over his shoulders. It's made of a special kind of velvet. It's richly embroidered with silk, with gold thread, with hundreds of pearls, with enamel plaques. And you can see the decoration shows you, it depicts 2 lions killing a camel. There's a symbol of a prince triumphing over his enemies. There are a lot of other meanings to this mantle, which I will not go into, but the most interesting thing in this connection is the writing along the border. And if you look very carefully, you can see that it's Arab writing. And it says, the inscription says in English, the translation, this belongs to the articles worked in the royal workshop, which has flourished with fortune and honor, with industry and perfection, with might and merit, with his sanction and his prosperity, with magnanimity and majesty, with renown and beauty and the fulfillment of desires and hopes, and with felicitous nights and days without cease or change, with honor and solicitude, with protection and defense, with success and certainty, with triumph and industry, in the capital city of Sicily in the year of 528. So it says 528 Hijri, which translates to 1133, 1134 in the European and the Western calendar. So we know this was made for King Roger II of Sicily. He was a Norman king of Sicily. But of course, Sicily had long been part of the Fatimid Empire, ruled from Cairo. But after the Normans conquered it, many Arabs remained, and especially the craftsmen, especially the textile craftsmen, were highly revered and remained and were given a lot of work. And many of them, as you can see, worked in the royal workshops in Palermo and made this incredible piece for the King of Sicily. You're probably now wondering why this thing is in Vienna. And how did it become one of the coronation mantle, one of the coronation vestments worn by the German emperor? The explanation is that Roger II of Sicily had a German grandson, Emperor Frederick II, and when he inherited this mantle from his grandfather, he took it to Germany. And once it was in Germany, it was always used for the coronations of the German emperor. It wasn't made for this, but because it was so spectacular and so exotic and so amazing, it was always used for the coronations of the German emperor. In the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire expanded quite dramatically. In 1517, for example, Selim I conquered Egypt, and in 1520, his son Suleiman the Magnificent succeeded him, and he decided to expand the empire northwards, westwards, towards Europe, towards Austria. So every summer he had a campaign, and he was advancing up the Balkans towards Vienna. In 1521 he conquered Belgrade. In 1526 there was a big battle, the Battle of Mohacs, where the Ottomans defeated the Hungarian army. Actually, the young king of Hungary, King Louis, died in that battle aged 20. He had no children, and he left only his widow, who was a Habsburg princess. And this is one of these examples how the Habsburgs inherited a country, in this case Hungary and Bohemia, through a marriage and inheritance contract. But most of Hungary stayed under Ottoman dominion. It was part of the Ottoman Empire for the next 200 years. So the Ottomans were slowly advancing towards Vienna. The Ottomans laid siege to Vienna. This was terrible. Nobody was really prepared for this. The emperor was fighting somewhere else. He didn't have enough money. Vienna wasn't really defended. The fortifications dated from the 13th century and in very bad repair. Everybody had been saying, we should do something, we should do something. But by the time the Ottomans arrived, it was, of course, too late. They were 17,000 defenders facing off against 80,000 well-trained Ottoman troops, including the feared Janissaries, plus 30,000 auxiliary troops from, for example, Bulgarians or Greek troops who were fighting with the Ottomans. It was 73 cannons on the defender sides against 300 on the Ottoman side. It was really a very one-sided affair. In a way, the Viennese were lucky because the roads in Hungary were really in a very, very bad condition. So the Ottomans were only able to bring two very big guns. The rest they had to leave behind. And because the roads are so bad, the supply lines didn't really work very well. Quite a lot of Hungarian soldiers died, 20,000 deaths in the camp outside Vienna. The defenders were really fighting valiantly for their lives. And winter came very early. It started already early October. So the Sultan decided to withdraw, and the plan was that he would come again the next year, and Vienna and Europe was saved for the time being. Luckily, for Vienna at least, it was another 150 years till the second siege of Vienna in 1683. The following century was marked, Austria and Hungary, they shared a border, because Austria, as I said, the Habsburgs had inherited Hungary, and the Ottomans had conquered most of Hungary. So for the next 100 years, they were very uneasy neighbors, and it was more or less a time of continual war, which was marked by outbreaks of fighting, by border raids. It was sometimes a cold war, sometimes a hot war, but the Ottomans were definitely the dominant party in all of this. We know that the Habsburgs frequently also paid tribute money. They paid the Ottomans not to attack them. For example, in 1606, in a peace treaty, they agreed to pay the enormous sum, just a one-off sum, but 200,000 guilders. That's really a lot of money. And often they would pay tributes annually. And interestingly, sometimes or quite often, part of this tribute were gifts, specially selected, sometimes even sort of chosen by the Sultan. So the Sultan would let the Austrians know, would let the Germans know what kind of gifts he would appreciate. And one such gift is this beautiful imperial toy, this automaton with a pasha. It's now in the museum in Vienna because, for reasons that are not quite clear, it was never sent to Istanbul. It remained in Vienna, it remained in the imperial collection, but similar objects were frequently, regularly sent together with precious arms and other objects that were clocks, for example, that were very popular. They were sent to Istanbul. This is a beautiful object. It's a princely toy. At the top you've got a little tip clearly designed to appeal to the Sultan. You have a pasha mounted on his horse, accompanied by a man with a dog. So that's a beautiful showpiece in itself. But the interesting thing is what's inside the base, because this is a state-of-the-art machine and it's a clock. And remember, in the 16th and 17th century, clocks were very, very elaborate, very, very refined technical instruments and hugely expensive. Today everybody has a watch on their smartphone, but only very, very few people in the 16th and 17th century could afford a clock like this. And this clock tells the hour and the quarter hour. And at every quarter hour, the dog jumps up and the man holding the leash raises his arm. And at every full hour, the man on the horse, the pasha on the horse, will raise his arm in a greeting. So that's a wonderful toy. And imagine you show this to your friends, or the Sultan was showing this to his friends, who thought this was just a beautiful little sculpture, and suddenly it starts to move. That is a wonderful effect that he was very, very keen on. As I said, objects like this were regularly sent to Istanbul, to the Ottoman court. This one was not sent, we're not exactly sure why. It remained in Vienna, and it's described in the inventory of Emperor Matthew, and it's a typical example of the sort of objects that were sent as tribute to the Ottomans. In the 16th century, there was not any war and conflict between the West and the Middle East. There were also diplomatic missions, trade missions, there was artistic exchanges, artists traveling, Western artists traveling to the Middle East. And there was a deep fascination with the sophistication, with the exoticism, with the wealth, the splendor of the Ottoman court. And I'd like to show you now, I'd like to talk about a few examples of non-judgmental depictions of the Ottoman Sultan in Western artworks. And the first one I want to show you is this huge religious painting by Titian. Titian is one of the greatest Venetian painters in the 16th century, one of the greatest painters of all time, I suppose. He did portraits, he did mythological scenes, and he did religious paintings. And this one is unusually large. It's 2.5 meters by 3.5 meters. It was painted for a very rich Dutch merchant who lived in Venice. And it was painted for his palace on the Canal Grande. It's called, it depicts a scene from the Passion of Christ. It's called the Ecce Homo. It was painted in 1543. It's a story from, as I said, the Passion of Christ. After Jesus was captured, he was incarcerated in the palace of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. And Pontius had sort of second thoughts whether he should have Jesus executed, so he takes him out on a balcony and shows him to the mocking crowd outside and says, Ecce homo. That's Latin, it means look at this man. And he hopes that they will have pity, but they had no pity, and they said, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. It's a scene that's very often depicted in Western art, but it's very unusual in Venetian art, and the reason probably is that the man who paid for it, the man who commissioned it, was a Dutch merchant, and so he chose this subject. The reason I want to talk about it today, the reason I'm showing it to you, is because it's full of political comments, or comments on the political situation at the time. Look at Pontius Pilate. He's the figure up on the stairs right at the far left. He's a portrait of Pietro Aretino, who was one of the most famous men of the time, a great friend of Titian's. He was a poet, a writer, an author, a witticist. He wrote witticisms, a satirist. He was also a blackmailer, incidentally. But he was hugely influential on Italian politics and Italian art of the time. Maybe today we'd call him an influencer. He'd have probably millions and millions of followers. if you look at the man in red in the center of the painting, he is the ruling doge. That's the man who is the ruler of Venice. Venice at the time was a republic, but the ruler was selected from a member of the nobility. His name is Pietro Lando, and he signed a peace treaty with the Ottomans in 1540. The pretty girl in white at the front that's looking at you, that's probably Titian's daughter. She's like inviting you into the painting. And next to her, maybe you can see the soldier sitting on the steps, and there's a big shield next to him with a double-headed eagle. That's the symbol of the Habsburgs. So it's a clear reference to the Habsburgs, because Titian was court painter to a Habsburg emperor, to Emperor Charles V. And above the shield is a little label, a little tablet, and it gives you the Titian signature and the date, and Titian gives you his full title because he was made an imperial knight. The emperor knighted him, and he was clearly very proud of that, so he puts that really spot in the center, right smack in the center of the composition. But in this context, the most interesting two figures are probably the two riders on the far right. The one pointing at Jesus, that is Alfonso Davalos. He's an imperial commander, general, who won a victory against the Ottomans in 1535. And the man he's talking to with a big, very impressive turban, that is none other than Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. And they're in conversation, they're almost equals. And what's probably happening here is Davalos is showing the Sultan his God. So they're in a deep discussion about religion, about the role of God, about their various religions. That is a non-judgmental and a very beautiful rendering of the Sultan in this beautiful painting by Titian. A wonderful example of a European artist traveling to Istanbul is this woodcut. It's part of a series of 10 woodcuts. Each is about 45 by 35 centimeters large or big, and the whole series is 4.5 meters long. And it was made by a Dutch artist, Pieter Cokke van Aalst, who's one of the greatest draftsmen of the 16th century. And he actually traveled to Istanbul because he wanted to persuade the Sultan to buy tapestries, which are the most expensive artworks produced in Europe at the time. The Sultan wasn't really interested, but while he was there, he made these woodcuts, which were probably also initially designed to be a model for a series of tapestries, which were never realized. And after he died, his wife published the woodcuts as they are, this series as they are. And this is the last one of the series. And I think it's rather lovely because it gives you the Sultan on a parade riding outside of Istanbul, and in the background you have the skyline of Istanbul in the 1530s, because we know that Cokke van Aalst was in Istanbul in 1533. And you can make out, if you look carefully, you can make out the Hagia Sophia, and you can make out an ancient Egyptian obelisk, which we know that Emperor Theodosius brought from Egypt in 390 AD, and there's also a serpent, it's called a serpent column, that Constantine the Great had taken from Delphi in Greece and taken to Istanbul. So he depicts all these things very, very carefully. It's almost like a proper view. It's like a photograph almost. And if you look at the Sultan again, he depicts him in all his splendor and all his beautiful outfits, his gorgeous turban and so on. Again, it's not a judgmental rendering of the Sultan, of the Ottomans. It demonstrates very clearly the fascination, the love of the beauty, the splendor, the fascination with the court of the Ottomans that was typical of Europe in the 16th and 17th century. Van Hanen, who commissioned that big painting by Titian, the Ecce Homo that I just talked about, he was a trader, a merchant from the Netherlands who lived in Venice. And Venice at the time was an independent republic. It was very wealthy. It was the center of the trade with the East, the Silk Route that ended in Constantinople, or before that in Mamluk Cairo. Many of these precious objects imported from the East would end up in Venice and then be sold on to the princes in Europe. Venice also had a big navy to protect her shipping. She had outposts in various parts, along the borders of the Mediterranean. It was a very, very wealthy city. Among the things they imported from the East was wheat, but also silks, and spices and velvets, lots of expensive luxury goods. And many of these objects later found their ways into the homes of the well-to-do, of the nobility, and naturally also into portraits these people commissioned of themselves or of their family members. The first portrait I would like to show you is this portrait by Titian. It's another work by Titian. We have one of the largest collections of Titians in the world in Vienna. It's a portrait of Francesco Salvaresio, who was a merchant in Venice from a very well-to-do family. They're from Venice. They were active in Venice, but also in Genoa and in Messina. And they traded with the Middle East. They imported wheat, they imported silks, they imported spices, they imported velvet, and they were also active in the slave trade. And when he commissioned this portrait of Titian, he was sure to display his wealth in various ways. When you look at the little tablet behind him on the wall, it gives you his name, and it gives you his age. He was 50 when this was painted, and the date, 1554, and it gives you the name of the artist Titian, because Titian was a very, very famous painter at the time. So he wanted to make sure that people realized that he had enough money to commission Titian and to persuade Titian to paint this portrait of him. And you can see the setting. He's inside a very nice room, and the things that he surrounds himself with depict how wealthy he is. His pose is very self-assured. His hand is in his belt, which is probably made of some kind of expensive oriental silk, probably. Then you have a little black servant boy next to him. Behind him on the shelf there is a clock. Remember, clocks are very expensive objects. So he refers to all of this in his painting, and he refers in a way also to his trade with the Middle East. Remember also that these portraits are very different from the pictures we take of ourselves today. Today we do hundreds, millions of snapshots on a smartphone, and you can delete them, and you can document your every outfit. But in the 16th century, such a portrait was very, very expensive, and many people never ever had a portrait of themselves taken. And if you had the money to commission one, then this would be the one, or maybe one of very, very few portraits of yourself or a member of your family, and you wanted to make sure that you were as nicely dressed and as best represented for posterity, so that everybody remembers who you were and how wealthy and how important you were. But I said that objects, luxury objects from the Middle East, found their way very often into such portraits. And here's another wonderful example. It's by Tintoretto. Tintoretto, together with Titian, is another great 16th century Venetian painter. It's a lady who looks not very friendly. She doesn't smile. She looks it straight in the face. She's very self-assured, I would think. There are very few female portraits by Tintoretto, but this really is a rather lovely one. And again, in her outfit, you see that she is very wealthy. She's wearing beautiful clothes. She wears lovely, perfectly matched, very large pearls. She's got a little dead ferret. That's again a luxury article many women carried in the 16th century. Don't ask me why, but it was popular at the time. The jewelry she wears and so on. But the most interesting thing in this context is on the table. It's a carpet. It's an Islamic carpet. Carpets were luxury articles imported from the Ottoman Empire, from the East. And they were very, very, very expensive, and it was like a must-have article in a well-to-do European household. So if you could afford it, you had a carpet. And because it was so valuable, you didn't put it on the floor, you put it on the table. And this is why there are a lot of precious Islamic carpets, Oriental carpets, in European paintings. In fact, there are so many of them that portraits or pictures by European artists are from the late 15th and 16th century are primary sources for art historians, for experts studying Oriental carpets, Islamic carpets. Because certain artists would use similar types, so there are carpets, Islamic carpets called Holbein carpets, Memling carpets, Lotto carpets, and so on. These are all Western artists who would introduce or paint or depict depict carpets in their paintings, and the designs, the color schemes are typical, and this is how that name was used for these carpets. So here's a carpet next to this not very friendly looking lady. And we also find carpets in religious paintings. Here's an example that's a little bit older. This is by Memling. He was a German artist who mainly worked in Bruges in the Netherlands, which was then one of the great centers of art in Europe. In the late 15th century, this was probably done around 1490, 95. And it's a religious painting. You have the Virgin Mary with Christ on a throne. And next to her is the donor, the man who paid for this. We unfortunately don't quite know his name. We don't no longer know his name. But the interesting thing is, look, in front of the Virgin, you have a precious Oriental carpet. And again, it's here to show her status and to set her apart from the ordinary surroundings around her. It sanctifies the space. But again, Memling is one of the artists who very often introduces carpets, Islamic carpets, into his paintings, and it's a name that's used to define a certain type of Oriental carpet. The Middle East, the Orient, didn't only affect or influence European luxury goods, they also in a way influenced fashions. And a wonderful example is this portrait by Titian again, of Isabella d'Este. Isabella d'Este was the Marchioness of Mantua, that's one of the principalities in northern Italy, and she was one of the most famous women of the Renaissance. She was a very well educated, she was very strong-willed, she was a great passionate collector of art, and she was desperate to own a portrait of herself by Titian, and this is it. And the reason I'm showing you this is because she was famous throughout Europe for her beauty and for her fashion sense. Princesses all over Europe would imitate and copy her. Actually, some of them had little dolls. They asked her to make little dolls of her newest outfit and have the dolls sent to whatever the French court or whatever, or another Italian court, and copy the outfit that Isabella wore. She really was a trendsetter in the early 16th century. And if you look very carefully, look what she's wearing on her head. It's something like a turban. It was called a balzar, or a balzar la Turki, so it's like a Turkish turban, and she was famous for that, and people copied that. It's like a little circlet over which she stretched, or someone stretched a piece of silk, and over this is like a web of a gilded web or something. It's really a quite elaborate thing, and it became almost her trademark, if you like. It was very popular with all fashion-conscious ladies in the early 16th century, in the first half of the 16th century. Isabella was really a very, very beautiful woman when she was young. This portrait was done when she was about 60. I'm sure you agree that she looks much younger than that, and the reason is very simple, that she was very beautiful when she was young. When she grew older, she grew less beautiful, and especially she grew extremely fat. She was so fat that she couldn't climb the stairs in her palace anymore. But she was vain, as many of us are. So she decided she wanted desperately to own a portrait of herself by Titian, because he was such a famous artist, but she didn't really want it to be depicted the way she looked. So she said, I don't really have time to sit for a portrait. And instead she sent him a portrait of herself when she was much younger by another artist. So Titian copied a portrait of her where she's much younger. But of course, she is wearing today's clothes with the face of 40 years ago, which I suppose is quite an interesting combination. And maybe in the defense of Titian, I should say that the portrait was cut. It was actually much wider, and at a later stage it was cut, so that's why she looks slightly squeezed into this portrait. But it's a lovely portrait nonetheless. And if you look at her headdress, at the turban, that is really one thing she was famous for. One of the many things she was famous for. And actually, I've got one other portrait that shows you another lady copying that or wearing a similar turban. This is by Parmigianino. It's another North Italian painter. Actually, his real name is Francesco Mazzola, but he comes from Parma, so he's usually named Parmigianino. And he did this around 1530, and we know that he was in Bologna at a time, and he portrayed the wife of a count in Bologna. He also did various other commissions for him, and it's an unfinished portrait. It's actually she's much closer to us. It's much more immediate in that way, and it's unfinished if you look at the background. But the interesting thing, of course, again, she's wearing this beautiful turban, an inspiration, a fashionable inspiration from the Middle East. Turbans, of course, are more generally associated not with women but with men. And I'd just like to show you one more example of that. This is by Veronese, together with Titian and Tintoretto, the third of the great 16th century Venetian painters. And this is a religious scene. It was very popular in Venice and actually all throughout Western art. It's the adoration of the three magi. It's a story from the Bible when Jesus was born in the manger in Bethlehem. The three wise men, or the star leads the three wise men to the manger, to Bethlehem, where they bring their gifts, present their gifts to Jesus. It's, as I said, depicted very often, and the three wise men, the three kings from the Orient, one of them is usually shown in Oriental costume. And this is a beautiful depiction of that. And if you look at him, he's got a lovely turban, beautiful Oriental robes, and Veronese is an artist who loves to paint silks and fabrics. So that really shows you, he really goes all the way here in this painting. And for Venetian painters, the Oriental costume is usually pretty realistic. So they don't go over the top. It's not fantastic as it is with many other European artists. The reason is probably that there were so many Middle Eastern merchants in Venice. Venetian artists had traveled to the Middle East. And as I showed you before, there were artists who'd been there, who brought back sketchbooks, prints, drawings, whatever. So they really had a very good idea of what Oriental costume looked like, how Orientals behaved. They were much more familiar with that than many other European artists at the time. And again, you can see that very well in this lovely painting. In the Middle Ages, knights wore full body armor on the battlefield. And it's very difficult to move in that. So they had tournaments to practice how to move, how to fight, how to ride when you're dressed in armor with a lance and so on. By the 16th century, this had become less and less useful on the battlefields with the invention of cannons and guns and so on. So tournaments became less of practice for war and more a princely spectacle. They are the most expensive, most lavish festivities, public festivities that they had in the 16th century. And they would stage these tournaments often with in disguise or with special storylines, narratives for coronations, for state visits, when the birth of a crown prince, important public events like this. In the middle of the 16th century, between 1547 and 1560, Archduke Ferdinand II, this is a younger son of Emperor Ferdinand I, Habsburg Emperor, German Emperor, Habsburg Emperor, he sent his son to be regent of Bohemia. Bohemia, the country the Habsburg had inherited after the Battle of Mohacs just about 20 years before. And during his time as governor or regent of Bohemia, the young Archduke pulled out all the stops. And he really wanted to impress the population. He had magnificent festivities. He had great parties and so on. And he staged amazing tournaments, public tournaments, many, as I said, in disguise. And he recorded all of them in his tournament book. So we have descriptions and pictures of, and we even have quite a number of the specially made pieces of armor that they used to wear. Let me give you a description of what he wears in this picture. The Archduke is here disguised as a Turkish warrior because these tournaments were called Hussars tournaments. The Hussars are Hungarian troops, elite troops who fought against the Ottomans along the border. And here you can see the Archduke on a grey horse, wearing a red velvet Hungarian jacket with gold buttons, a Hungarian hat with white hair on feathers, a sabre in a red sheath, red riding boots with gold spurs, shields, and long hollow lances, typical of Hungarian or Turkish lances. They're actually called kopis. So the Archduke staged elaborate, expensive public tournaments in which hussars, participants dressed as hussars, fought participants dressed as Ottomans or Moors. So in a way, he's restaging the political situation, if you like. But both participants, everybody participating in this tournament, were Austrian or Bohemian noblemen. So they were taking both sides. It's not the good against the bad. It's both are equally good, if you like. Here are some examples of the kind of disguise they wore. If you look at this mask, for example, it gives you, this is from a hussar's mask, and you can see it's it gives you the face. It's made of iron with horsehair. It even gives you the sort of like a moustache. That's the horsehair. It's really quite cleverly done. If you look at the eyes, you can see there's no way you can look out from that. And if look at what's actually the slit for the eyes to see out are the eyebrows. It's really quite cleverly done. And it's so small because he would wear a big Hungarian hat on top of it, but that has not survived. We've also got some other examples of the kind of things they were wearing. Here's one of these big kopi, one of these big shields I was talking about before, and a helmet that was worn by the Archduke himself. Typically it imitates Oriental helmets, Ottoman helmets, and you have, it looks a bit dull on this wooden horse, but you have the outfit put together. So you had in these elaborately staged tournaments, you had the hussars, or you had participants dressed up as hussars and Hungarians, or as Moors and Muslims fighting each other. But as I said before, both roles were taken by members of the Austrian and the Bohemian nobility. How is that possible? The explanation for this is that there was a very famous book. It's called Orlando Furioso by Ariosto. If you've never heard of it, it's not surprising. It's not very well known today, but it was one of the most famous, most influential books in the 16th century. It was first published in 1516, and it's an epic poem with 38,000 and a bit lines. It's really incredibly long, and it's a fantastic tale. It's a tale of love and war and humor and tragedy all wrapped into one. And you have Christian and Muslim soldiers and female fighters, female knights also. You have sorcerers and magicians and fantastic creatures like a hippogriff that's half griffin and half horse, and a sea monster, and it's really an incredible tale that takes for a very, very long time. And as I said, it was very, very influential, very well known in the 16th century, and many of the members of the nobility probably knew bits or most of it by heart. It tells the story it mixes historical figures with fantastic creatures and there's everything mixed together. So it's actually the story of a Saracen king who is angry at the death of his father, and he invades Europe from Africa, and he invades France and lays siege to the capital of Charlemagne. And it's the duel between the Christian and the Muslim knights, and it's all about chivalry and bravery and so on. And as I said, there are female and male fighters that fall in love, that fight each other, that help each other. It's really an incredible tale. And because the people taking up these roles in these hussars tournaments knew the story of Orlando Furioso, they were very happy to assume also the roles of these brave Muslim knights. It was not good against bad. It was not Indians against cowboys, as in an American film. It was clear that both sides were equally brave, equally valiant, equally chivalrous in their fights. One of the main storyline tells of Rolando, who falls in love with beautiful Angelica. She is a Saracen knight princess, and he falls in love with her. She doesn't love him, and eventually he loses his mind over this. And the story takes place all over the world, including the moon, because one of his friends, he takes the hippogriff and goes to Ethiopia, and then he goes to the moon, because apparently everything that is lost on Earth can be found on the moon, apparently. And he finds Rolando's wits, and he puts them in a bottle, and he takes them back to Earth, and as soon as Rolando sniffs the bottle, he's sane again, and everything is safe. And actually he stops falling in love, because one of the sidelines is that one of the messages, if you like, that love is a form of insanity. Really mad, crazy love is a form of insanity. And another storyline is the love affair between Bradamante, a beautiful Christian female knight, and Ruggiero, a brave and chivalrous Muslim knight. And there are many problems to be overcome until finally there is a happy end and they marry. And legend has it that they are the founding fathers, that they founded the dynasty that ruled Mantua. Remember Mantua, the principality in northern Italy? Isabella d'Este, and her husband ruled that in the first half of the 16th century. And the author of Orlando Furioso Ariosto, his patron was also the ruler of Mantua. I'd like to end with some beautiful flower still lifes from the early 17th century. And you're now probably wondering, what has this to do with the Middle East? If you look at these flower still lifes, and actually most flower still lifes produced by Western artists in the 17th century, you'll notice that tulips play a very, very prominent role in them. And that's no accident. Tulip cultivation was adopted from the Persians by the Turks in the 15th century, and they became very popular in Turkey. The Sultan grew them in his gardens. They were very, very expensive, very beautiful, very highly regarded flowers. And in 1554, there was a Habsburg ambassador called de Busbecq, and he went to Istanbul to negotiate a treaty with the Ottomans, and then a year later, in 1555, he became Habsburg ambassador to the Sublime Porte for 5 or 6 years. And he became, I don't want to say a friend of the Sultan, but he gained the Sultan's trust, and as a sign of his appreciation of his friendship, the Sultan presented him with a number of bulbs, tulip bulbs, and de Busbecq brought them back to Vienna, and from Vienna they made their way very quickly throughout all over Europe, and actually they became very popular in the Netherlands. Today still we associate tulips with the Netherlands because they grow millions and millions of them every year. In the early 17th centuries, tulips were not grown in bunches, but you would plant like one, and then another one, and another one. They were like individual flowers because they were so highly valued and highly treasured. And they became hugely popular in the Netherlands in the first half of the 17th century. And actually, it led to what is known as the first asset bubble. It's called Tulip Mania, because people suddenly started to trade in them, trade futures in tulip. They started to trade and auction off the bulbs, and the value of these bulbs would double overnight. People could make huge sums of money. And of course, once this starts, everybody's trying to get in. The prices rose to incredible heights. There was a time when for one very special bulb, but still just one bulb, one tulip bulb, was the price of a big house in the center of Amsterdam. A house in Zamalek, a villa in Zamalek for one tulip bulb, that seems a very, very impressive price. So everybody was piling, and people were buying. And then, of course, that happened. What happens with every bubble? It burst. A lot of people went bankrupt. A lot of people lost money. It's not the fault of the Ottomans, but it is the reason why tulips play such a prominent role in many still lifes by Western artists. Well, that's the end of my little talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope I've been able to give you a few examples of how the Middle East has influenced Western art. And as I said, all of these objects, all of these beautiful artworks are in the collections of the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. And I very much hope that you will have time and the opportunity to come and see them in reality, because they look so much more beautiful than they do on a picture or on a photograph. Thank you very much.